Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm looking forward today to sharing some of what we learned from the 2020 Community Dataset for the Research Computing and Data Capabilities Model. My name is Patrick Schmitz, and some of you may know me as co-chair of several CARC working groups, including the one that supports the RCD Capabilities Model, and I'm active in some others. I spent about a dozen years at Berkeley, where I was involved with research IT and led the research computing group. And now, for the past couple of years, I've been working with institutions and organizations like CARC and Internet2 to advance the practice of research computing and data and advance the profession of folks like us who support RCD. So I want to take a minute to define what we mean by RCD and note that it's meant to be inclusive, like CI. Research computing and data, abbreviated as RCD, includes technology, services, and people supporting the needs of researchers and research. It's intended as a broad, inclusive term covering computing, data, software, systems, networking, instrumentation, and especially the people. The National Science Foundation, or NSF, uses the term cyber infrastructure, and others use research IT. I also want to note the involvement of key partners in this project. Internet2 originally seeded the ideas and got the discussions for the capabilities model going. CARC facilitated the working group that developed the tools and continues to support this work. And EDUCAUSE support includes their own RCD community group and the team there that supports the core data service, who's helped us with expertise in this kind of data gathering. Now, this paper could really have had a huge list of authors. A lot of folks have worked to create and refine the RCD capabilities model and contributed to the data set analysis that I'm presenting. And I really want to acknowledge the contributions they've all made and give my thanks to all of them. So for those of you who are not already familiar with the capabilities model, many of us have asked at some point, how can we get a comprehensive view of our support? How do we represent the state of our research computing and data services to our leadership and key stakeholders? And then, are we missing something? What else should we be paying attention to that we might not have thought of? And finally, as we think about strategic planning, funding, and hiring, how can we identify areas for improvement and growth? The model allows institutions to assess their support for computationally and data-intensive research. The structured model facilitates discussion among different groups, roles, and service providers. It helps you identify gaps. These gaps may already be on your radar, or they may be in areas that you were not thinking about. The model was developed by a diverse group of institutions with a range of support models in a collaboration, as I mentioned, among Internet2, CARC, and EDUCAUSE. This assessment tool is designed for use by a broad range of institutions. The structured model shared across the community facilitates the gathering of a valuable data set, what I'm going to be talking about today, for understanding broader trends, as well as patterns among subgroups, for example, emerging centers versus R1s or EPSCoR institutions. We have the 2020 community data set. We're working on the 2021 now, but I'll be sharing some of the insights gained from the data set today. So it was designed, as I say, the capabilities model was designed for a range of roles and stakeholders, including campus research computing and data practitioners, like many of you in the audience, PIs and research team members, whether they're faculty or staff, key partners, including central IT, libraries in particular, centers and institutes and others, and of course, campus leadership. We designed it to be useful across institution types and institutional organizational models. That last point is key. The model is agnostic about how your institution provides services and instead emphasizes what researchers have access to. So what is the tool? It's a structured means of assessing the state of your RCD support. The version 1 prototype of the tool was implemented as a Google spreadsheet, which enables you to have a collaborative team working together on it as you're filling it out. It poses a series of about 150 questions for you to consider. The answers to those questions yield a computed coverage value, where those answers are color-coded to provide a heat map view of your assessment, ranging from green for pretty good to red where you've got gaps. Now, it's important to note most institutions cannot realistically think about complete coverage across all these topics. It's an aspirational model, reflecting the union of all the things that the community thinks are important to consider in supporting RCD. In particular, it makes no sense to compare the coverage values to grades on an exam where you're expected to actually know all the material. Median values are generally in the 50s and 60s, with a good deal of variation around that median. The model divides areas of capabilities based upon a concept called facings, with one tab for each area. Now, many of you are probably familiar with this. It's just a way of organizing the roles in our work, whether most of what you're doing is directly working with researchers, working with data, with software, perhaps you're working mostly on systems, or strategy and policy facing for those in leadership. A lot of folks have multiple roles, so this is a way of dividing up the work and the roles, not the people or the teams. Now, I'm going to dive in a little bit, but not too far. If you really want to know more about the model, there's a PEARC21 paper that explains the model in some detail. There's also a lot of resources available on the CARC site. For each of the questions, there's a couple of lenses that we ask you to consider. One of them is deployment at your institution. This is really, is it available to folks? You may not have anything there. You have no deployment or support, or you may be just tracking use, considering it. You may be in a planning, piloting, or initial deployment situation where you're just booting up a service. Many services will be available to parts of the institution, or if you're in a really good situation, everybody at your institution, regardless of college or department, has access to the services. Another lens we consider is the service operating level. Now, this is inspired by some IT ideas in IT service management. And it's really a measure of how robust is your service. If you've actually got something that's basically running with a single grad student and you don't know where your funding is coming from next year, you might be at substantial risk of failure. Many services are either in a lights on only or a basic economy mode, which ranges from doing the absolute minimum to keep it running to running along, and every once in a while you can add something new or handle a request. If you're in a really good situation, you might be able to handle all sorts of special requests and add new features all the time. That's what we would characterize as a priority or premium service. So this gives you some sense of how people are actually assessing the state of their individual services. In addition to assessing your current state, the team can mark specific areas for attention. Now, it's worth noting, you might have low coverage in an area and not make something a priority. It may just not be important to your researchers or for your current initiatives on campus. You may also have pretty good coverage in an area and yet want to continue to make investment and develop in that area. If that's something that's really important, it's a major initiative on campus, you need to really have a high level service in order to support your researchers. As you complete the survey, a summary sheet automatically rolls up the different areas into a view that you can use in discussions with leadership, key stakeholders, and others. There's even a bar graph you can grab for reports or presentations that was actually requested from folks in the community. Each facing has a summary coverage value, and you can drill down one step to see the major themes within that facing, providing some high-level view of your support. So for example, here we have the software facing. There's a couple of areas where we're doing quite well, several others not so well, and in the area of workflow engineering, workflow management, we've got basically nothing there, and so that shows up as a big red gap in our support. So you remember the priorities marking feature I just showed? The summary view also gathers up the items your team marked as a priority. And again, it's just to make it easier to feed these ideas into your strategic planning work or to generate a quick report for your leadership. Just a reminder again, your priorities don't contribute to the capabilities coverage. It's just a tool for your use as you're doing your assessment. So who's using it? To date, which is since a year ago, January, when the model was released, we've seen about 150 downloads, and those represent institutions in 44 states and territories, the District of Columbia, 4 Canadian provinces, and even a couple institutions in the United Kingdom. We see there's a pretty good mix across Carnegie classifications between publics and privates and other subgroups within the community. When we have people download the tool, we ask them how they think they're going to want to use it. Not surprisingly, most people want to use it for strategic planning, and many of them are interested in benchmarking their current service offerings against the community, which is what the data set's really good for. Many others, especially in emerging programs or those that are really trying to grow, want to understand common practices across the rest of the community. So, as I mentioned, many of the things institutions want is insight into how they're doing relative to the community and some of their peers. We created simple benchmarking reports that put your institution's results in context. The screenshot gives you an idea of what one of these benchmarking reports looks like for a hypothetical result. There's a lot of data here, so let's take a look at some of the key points. Looking just at the data-facing summary areas, we see the percentage coverage values that this institution indicated in their self-assessment and the tier this is associated to given the data from the entire community who contributed data. Now, the tiers are not defined as absolute values, but rather as quartiles of the values in the data set. Tier 1 is the top tier and is highlighted in blue. You can see a couple of rows there. Tiers 2 and 3 are in green and yellow, and tier 4, the lowest one, the lowest quartile of the data, is in red. We also show the percentage coverage values for a set of subcommunities. And here the image is zoomed in on several of these subsets to show where this institution stands relative to those specific groups of possible peers. So if this was a public institution, the first of the 4 columns on the right shows that they are tier 1 for data security, secure data support, and tier 2 and 3 for the other areas. If it were a private institution, the second of the 4 columns on the right shows that their standing is generally a bit lower, given that there's just higher standards, generally, or higher bar in the among the private institutions. And with coverage of data analysis and data viz in the lowest tier, those areas might well merit attention. On the other hand, if they're actually an R2 institution in the Carnegie classification scheme, they're actually doing pretty well. Although again, data analysis and data viz are areas where they're behind many other peers. So you use this relative to the set of institutions that you want to benchmark against. Now, 41 institutions completed and contributed data to the 2020 data set. This scatter plot shows the distribution of those. And in the graph, each vertical slice is one institution. Several features stand out right away. First of all, institutions are literally all over the map. There's also a very wide range of coverage across the institutions. You see, there's not a lot of clear patterns among them all. Only a few institutions have coverage values that are consistent across the facings. Most of them have fairly different levels of coverage in each facing, or at least one facing for which coverage is fairly different. Also, there's fairly little commonality to the relative ranking of facing coverage across institutions, which is to say different institutions have strengths and weaknesses in different areas. This is actually promising for collaborations. The odds are you'll be able to find a partner that actually has strengths in areas where you've got gaps, which means you can collaborate on sharing leading practices and how to better support those services. This graph is another example of what we can learn from the data and represents how the community is doing broadly in each of the 5 areas. Of note, the institutional demographics of the participating institutions are comparable to those shown for the larger community who have downloaded but not yet completed the tool. Institutions generally, as you see here, do better at system-facing capabilities, strategy and policy-facing, and researcher-facing relative to the data and software-facing capabilities areas. Also note there's considerable variation. The error bars are one standard deviation and shows the huge range of values among different institutions in the community that contributed. Here's a view into the data comparing the public and private institutions within the data set. Note that the private institutions consistently have higher capabilities coverage than the represented public institutions. This may not surprise folks much, but it is useful to have real data to show this. Also of note is the variation among public institutions, which is considerably greater than that of the privates, again, except for the system-facing capabilities. So you see the error bars are much larger on the publics than they are for the privates. Here's another example looking at general areas of researcher-facing capabilities and groups by Carnegie classification. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, R1s have considerably more coverage or broader coverage than R2s in the first 3 key areas shown here for the researcher-facing topics: in staffing, outreach, and advanced support capabilities. And both groups have higher coverage than the other types of institutions, which are mostly smaller institutions. However, looking at the capabilities around research lifecycle management, the distinctions aren't quite so clear, nor is the variation. This may be because that's an area that's somewhat more regulated and you kind of have to do well at that to support research. EPSCoR, which is the established program to stimulate competitive research, is a special funding program for states that otherwise receive less than 0.75% of NSF research funding. There are 25 states and US territories that are EPSCoR eligible, and they include a little over 20% of the R1 and R2 institutions across the country. This graph shows the gap between institutions in those states compared to those in states that get more NSF funding. So these are basically underfunded states. While the system side of things is not too much different, the EPSCoR institutions find themselves with significantly less capabilities coverage in most other areas. And in particular, you see the data facing, there's a big gap. Let's dig into that. Looking at the topics within data facing, we see the specific themes and the differences in EPSCoR and non-EPSCoR institutions. Note in particular, the key areas like data viz, data visualization, and data analysis, there's pretty big gaps. But at the bottom one, support for secure and sensitive data shows a really wide gap between the EPSCoR and non-EPSCoR ones. Now, this kind of data turns out to be really useful for those institutions. There's a group of EPSCoR institutions led by Gwen Jacob at University of Hawaii that is working to understand the common challenges, common gaps, and approaches to those gaps that institutions in EPSCoR states have, and how they might work together and collaborate, both to understand what's going on and to think about some strategies to address those. So that's just an example of where people are leveraging the capabilities model and the data that's coming out of it to actually do their strategic planning, even at a collaborative level. So that gives you some idea of what this kind of data can tell us. Last year, we presented our analysis of the 2020 data set, the full report of it, and made it available. You can see that linked here. The publicly available version of that report provides summary findings, and the version that we provide to contributing institutions, along with their benchmarking, includes more detailed data. So beyond what I've described here, the data set also includes an analysis of what the community and subsets of the community marked as priorities for their programs. There's some interesting patterns in there. The contributing institutions, as I mentioned, also get benchmarking reports, and they get access to the underlying anonymized data if they want to do their own analysis. So I hope this has given you an idea of how your institutions can use the capabilities model to assess your coverage, and how you can use the community data set to understand your coverage in the context of the community. We're currently working to support the 2021 community data set, which will aggregate 2 years of institutional assessment, 2020 and 2021. We have a host of support activities for institutions interested in completing assessment and for using the data in their strategic planning. A Monday workshop here at PEARC21 is exploring approaches to strategic planning, leveraging the capabilities model in that process. A Birds of a Feather session on Tuesday will gather institutions interested in sharing the findings and opportunities around this, in particular the EPSCoR states, but also others who want to join in that discussion. That work in particular is leading to a workshop at the 27th National EPSCoR meeting next May. The new RCD Nexus is an NSF-funded Center of Excellence pilot to develop a research, computing, and data resource and career center, which you can hear more about at the CARC Town Hall on Wednesday. Among many activities, it includes funding to re-implement the capabilities model assessment tool as a hosted survey, and to develop a data portal that allows institutions much nicer tools for exploring the data set and to relate their own assessment to peer groups and others within the community. The RCD Nexus also provides additional funding to support institutions using the tools, including expert consulting to complete your assessments and incorporate these into a strategic plan for your RCD program. As you can imagine, we are really pleased to have received the support from NSF, and we're excited to expand our support for the capabilities model and the community data sets that it makes possible. Thanks very much. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have at the Q&A session that's coming up Tuesday morning. And with that, I will say goodbye and thank you for your attention.